The Outlast series is renowned for its intense themes and gory imagery that it throws the player into, and I've seen a lot of debates discussing which of the three protagonists had the worst experience. And if you don't know anything about this series or haven't played one of the games on this list, don't worry, because I'm going to be summarizing the games, mainly focusing on the major events that the protagonist had to suffer through. Also, this is in post, but please don't take anything I say about these games with face value, because in all honesty, I just said a bunch of random stupid shit that loosely summarizes the games. So just for a quick overview, we're going to be talking about Miles Upshur from the first game, Waylon Park from Whistleblowers, and Blake Langerman from the second game. So basically, geeked up white boy, even geekier geeked up white boy, and even whiter geeked up white boy. Also, what is with it in horror game protagonists being blonde white guys with a multi-layer green or tan like outfit? Like, I swear to God, it's in every single horror game, but shout out I guess because it's gotta be one of my favorite genders. So with that being said, let's talk about the games. The first game starts with Miles Upshur arriving at Mount Massive Asylum after getting an email about all the evil bad shit going on over there. Miles is a freelance journalist and plans on exposing the company, and coming to think of it, I really don't know what his plan was. Like, was he just gonna walk through the front door and start recording all the bad stuff going on and have nobody care? But luckily for Miles, everyone is mostly dead, and someone left a window open for him. After stumbling around, Miles finds some dead guys, and one almost dead guy who tells him he needs to leave. So while Miles makes his way out, Chris Walker, a big deformed mental patient, decides to so kindly help Miles leave by throwing him off the second story. Now, this is the first injury of Miles, or at least should be the first injury, because Miles walks away without even a scratch. I feel like getting thrown down 20 feet or so and landing on your back and the back of your head probably isn't good for your spine. But I guess Miles is fine because he walks away unharmed. And as we'll see later in the video, this will be a recurring thing. After some walking around, Miles gets jumped by some crackhead on a wheelchair. He gets choked out a little bit, but ends up being alright. Miles is then tasked with making it to the security room to unlock the front door, and gets interrupted by Chris Walker, who is one of the bad guys roaming the halls trying to stop you. And I feel like it's pretty obvious, but I'm not going to be talking about all the encounters with the enemies that don't canonically harm the protagonist, because being chased by someone is pretty much the entirety of the three games. And I'm also not going to be talking about all the traumatic and horrific things the protagonists have to see, because once again, the entire Outlast series is just exposing a random white guy to some intense gore, and that would most definitely desensitize them, or at least cause some sort of mental trauma in them. Once Miles is about to turn the security doors off, he gets drugged by Father Martin, who is a patient that is also a wannabe priest and thinks you ain't seen shit yet, so he drugs Miles and puts him deeper into the asylum. Miles comes across a bunch of wacky fellas and tries to find a way out. A bit later, Miles is being chased by Chris, and an explosion goes off, causing Miles to fall down 3 stories and landing on his back again. Now, I have no clue how Miles isn't paralyzed yet, but from the fall it looks like he lands on his upper back and the back of his head, but I guess the fall was broken by some corpses, so that negates all damages. After escaping the mail ward and the sewers, Miles is being chased by some naked guys, but luckily he is then saved by some super nice guy named Dr. Traeger. And if you couldn't tell, Dr. Traeger isn't so nice and punches Miles a few times and then cuts off some of his fingers, so he probably shouldn't have gone with him. And to be more specific, Dr. Traeger has a giant pair of scissors that he cuts off Miles' right index finger and his left ring finger. And then Miles throws up because that's kinda yucky. But in the end, Miles gets the last laugh because Dr. Traeger gets crushed by an elevator. Then a bunch of the game goes by, but Miles isn't really affected by it, so I won't be talking about every little side quest. But Miles gets jump scared by the wall rider a few times, which is pretty much some skeleton ghost we'll talk about later in the video. Miles loses his camera, Miles finds his camera, Miles records some bad stuff going on. Father Martin tells Miles to quote-unquote check this cool shit out, bro, and then kills himself in front of Miles in probably the worst way someone could kill themselves. Miles then takes the elevator down to leave, but it goes a little too far down and then he ends up in the secret lab under the asylum. Miles then finds Chris Walker in the lab, which I'm completely confused on how he even got down there in the first place. But luckily the wall rider is here to Gmod ragdoll Chris around for a few moments before doing a crazy magic trick by turning Chris into some Kool-Aid. Miles then meets an evil Nazi scientist who basically says you have to kill the wall rider by finding the host in the lab and turning him into Kool-Aid. So Miles goes to kill the wall rider, but who could have ever saw this coming? Miles is then thrown down probably 8 more stories, and then walks it off like a champ. Miles then fills the Wall Rider's test tube with Kool-Aid, but then the Wall Rider gets mad because he hates the red flavor, so the Wall Rider throws him around a bit and then transfers into Miles. And then who wants to take a wild guess what happens to Miles next? Is it A, Miles dies? Is it B, Miles gets thrown down 3 more stories? Or is it C, he gets the power of flight? I want everyone to take a quick moment to write down their comment, because it is answer B. Miles gets thrown down 3 more stories. And it's probably clear that having a ghost forcefully enter you and falling down probably around 17 floors throughout the night isn't very good for your mental health. So Miles stumbles out of the lab, and this night could not possibly get any worse.
You have become the host. What is that thing?
Yep, Miles is gunned down and is now the Wall Rider. So that concludes our first protagonist, who ends up being killed and turned into what is essentially a ghost. So yeah, it's gonna be pretty hard to top this, but let's move on to Waylon in the Whistleblowers DLC. Whistleblower starts off with Waylon writing the email exposing Markov that Miles would later receive. And coming to think of it, the email is sent, and no more than a few hours later does Miles arrive to the asylum. So Miles is really quick to get the email and head to the asylum without any worry. But anyways, Waylon is called into the lab to help with some computer problems. It's also a good time to mention that Waylon is the IT guy for Markov, working as an intern. Waylon sees them move a new patient into the morphogenic engine, which is the thing that makes the Wall Rider ghost. The new patient is a guy named Eddie Gluskin, and this is important because we will come back to him later. Waylon is sent back to his office when Jeremy Blair jumps him and finds out that he sent the email exposing them. Jeremy is in charge of the asylum and is not too happy with Waylon exposing the company, so Waylon generously decides to commit himself to the asylum and to new experimental testing. Waylon is then punched by a guard and wakes up in a room where he is forced to watch some weird static. But luckily enough, the Wall Rider escapes and starts killing everyone in the asylum. Now, I'm going to count this as mental damage to Waylon, as the weird static is imprinting on his vision and doesn't go away for the next little while. So it's safe to say that he suffered a little bit of brain damage at the least due to this. Waylon tries to look for a way out, and since he's in the middle of the chaos, he witnesses a ton of people being brutally killed. And this is when we're introduced to my favorite character in all of the Outlast series, the itchy mental patient. Yeah, that's not his name, but then again, he doesn't have one. All he really does is follow Waylon around and say that he has an itch, and he wants to be friends with Waylon. So, I mean, if anything, this is like negative trauma on Waylon's part, because he just made a new friend. Waylon comes across the first main enemy of the game, Frank Manera, who is a cannibal that wants to eat Waylon so bad he puts him into a brick oven. But Waylon kicks out some of the loose bricks and escapes with not a scratch. Waylon makes it to the asylum yard and has to bear witness to an inmate suck ass at human head basketball. Come on, shoot it, dude, shoot it, come on. Oh, he's dog shit. Waylon then makes it to the radio tower and tries to call the police before Jeremy gives him a crazy elbow to the face and then proceeds to have gamer rage on the controls. He then gives Waylon a crazy backhand with a baton and then chokes him out for a little bit before Chris Walker shows up and scares Jeremy away. Waylon navigates the asylum for a little bit before trying to jump across buildings, but ends up falling through the roof and landing in the female ward. Now, this is the part of the video where I would make some joke about Waylon falling through the roof and ending up perfectly fine, but as a matter of fact, he's not fine. He's fucked, because Eddie Gluskin is in the female ward. Yeah, that naked guy from earlier, he's the one stalking this location. And you know it's bad when the other inmates have to warn you about how evil and nasty this dude is. Now, let me tell you a thing about Eddie. This guy loves pussy. As a matter of fact, this dude loves pussy so much that he spent the whole night giving all the dudes who entered the female ward bottom surgery. Waylon likes his balls, so he decides to run from Eddie, and he likes his balls so much that he would fall down an elevator shaft and break his leg a little bit. And it's not clear if he breaks his foot or breaks his leg, but he clearly gets a wood spike through it, and that probably isn't very good for him. Waylon then runs for a little bit, but he thinks he's in Dead by Daylight, so he tries to hide in a locker, but little to Waylon's surprise, Eddie is running the Darkness Revealed perk, and sees Waylon in the locker and hits him with sleeping gas, where he sleeps for 12 hours. And in this time span, all of the events of Outlast 1 take place. Waylon wakes up to some crazy gender reassignment surgery, and after the first guy gets a little too rowdy, it's now Waylon's turn. But before his Audi can get turned into an innie, some guy hits Gluskin, allowing Waylon to escape. Eddie chases Waylon for a little bit before he jumps out the second story window and messes up his leg even further. Eddie then catches up to Waylon and punches him in the face. Like, quite a few times he gets punched in the face. Eddie then hangs Waylon by the neck, but due to Waylon struggling and being a fat ass, Waylon gets dropped and Eddie gets impaled by a few rods. Waylon tries to get out of there and sees a church burning down, which was from Father Martin's cool fire stunt from the first game. And after making it to the front exit, Jeremy's lying on the floor asking Waylon for help before hitting him with the classic knife to the stomach trick. But luckily the Wall Rider shows up, which is now controlled by Miles, and explodes Jeremy. Waylon then steals Miles' Jeep, and Waylon takes one last look at Ghost Miles before driving away, actually surviving the night and exposing the Murkoff Company. And that ends Whistleblowers, with Waylon actually surviving and not having a half bad night. But now let's move on to Blake Langerman from Outlast 2. Blake and his wife Lynn are journalists, and they are flying over the Havasupai reservation to go investigate a case of a strange pregnant woman. But it's not before long a flash of light goes off and causes the helicopter to crash. Blake is relatively fine and goes to look for his wife and the pilot, only to find that the pilot is strung up and skinned, so something is clearly off. Lynn is acting a little weird and her stomach is hurting, but it's interrupted by them getting jumped by some hooligans. Lynn gets taken away and Blake gets licked a little bit by some crazy lady who represents the heretics. They kidnap Lynn because she's supposedly pregnant with the Antichrist, and they want the baby to be born so the world can explode or something. And on the other hand, there is the cult who want Lynn and the baby killed so the Antichrist won't be born. With that knowledge, Blake sets out to find Lynn again. Throughout the game, Blake goes into flashbacks of his time in Catholic school, where he's tormented by the memory of his friend Jessica, who was raped by one of the priests and killed. And Blake lives with the guilt of not being there to save her and feels that it's his fault. So just keep that in mind because flashbacks will go on throughout the game. In one of Blake's flashbacks, it ends with him walking off a cliff, but luckily at the bottom of the cliff is a super nice guy who takes Blake in and he gets killed. Blake is chased by some townfolk and finds out that Lynn is being held in the mines, so after watching a lady get her limbs stretched, he heads for the mine. Blake is crossing a bridge, but I guess he has beef with Moses or something because a swarm of locusts knock him off the bridge.
Watch out, it's fucking hornets! What the fuck is that, locust? Fuck! They fucking got all over me!
Blake then tries to get back up the cliff, but is harassed by some leopards and he falls down the cliff again, seemingly also being fine. Blake comes across Laird and Nick, who are a giant deformed guy and a midget riding on his back. So yeah, Blake now has beef with the gargantuan zombie from Plants vs. Zombies. The duo rub some blood on Blake and then nail him to a cross? Yeah, this is probably the worst thing that has happened to someone in this video so far. But luckily Blake is a real trooper and pulls the nails through the rest of his hand and gets off the cross. Blake then has a real bad habit of falling down more cliffs and ends up sliding into barbed wire. Laird and Nick find Blake strung up in the wire and then bury him alive. Luckily, the duo only bury Blake under like 2 inches of dirt. I don't know what their plan was, but Blake easily escapes being buried alive because it's under like 1 inch of dirt. I don't even know why they did that. Blake then goes for a little swim before a tidal wave knocks Blake off his raft. And then the good old lake monster pulls up and pulls him down a little bit. If it wasn't obvious already, Blake's sanity is rapidly deteriorating. And to be more specific, it's being caused by the flashing beacons that have been happening throughout the game, making him go crazier every single time it goes off. Blake makes it to the mines and finds Lynn, but unfortunately stumbles into a heretics orgy and gets gripped by one of them. But luckily the cultist shows up and start killing the heretics, so Blake gets Lynn and leaves the mines. The only problem is, Lynn is now 9 months pregnant, and clearly wasn't earlier in the night, so something weird is happening. But before much later, Lynn then gives birth and dies of blood loss. But the only problem is, the baby isn't real, and Blake's mind is clearly scrambled. So he walks outside with the not-so-real baby, and then the sun explodes. Yeah, that was Outlast 2. But according to the comic books, the sun doesn't actually explode, and it was just a swarm of ants who knock over the beacon tower, causing it to have a big explosion. And the ants were controlled by the wall rider. So, you can blame the ending of Outlast 2 to a swarm of ants. Blake is then picked up by the Murkoff cleanup squad, and Blake's mind is clearly scrambled beyond repair. And I don't think the Murkoff Corporation is the kind of people to let Blake go and just live his life, or what is seemingly the rest of his life. So Blake is either then killed or imprisoned in the nearby facility for the rest of his life until he dies. So what a fun and wholesome 3 games we just talked about. Now let's break the characters down and rank them. Coming to last place is Waylon. Now, it's obvious that Waylon had the best fate, as he's the only one who technically survives and goes into hiding with his family. Although he does get beat up and assaulted by multiple people, stabbed by Jeremy, and falls down the elevator shaft and maybe breaks his leg a little bit. But for the most part, a lot of his night was stuff that almost happened. Like, he almost gets cooked alive, but leaves unharmed. And he almost gets his balls cut off, but leaves unharmed. I will give a point for mental damage, as he has to go through the experiment where his vision is imprinted on, which probably messed up his brain to some degree, but for the most part, he pretty much got off relatively well. Oh, and I almost forgot, and I haven't mentioned yet, Waylon works as the IT for Murkoff, which means he had to go to college for computer science. And I'm just going to throw that up there because that's probably a worse fate than death. But let's move on to number 2. Now, it was really hard to figure out who had it the second worst between Miles and Blake, but in the end, I'm gonna have to give it to Miles. Miles gets assaulted a few times by some inmates, he gets thrown down tons of stories throughout the night, and somehow doesn't slip a disc. He also gets his fingers cut off and turned into the wall rider before being shot to death, but I guess he's technically not dead because he now lives on in the wall rider, but I don't think Miles had it that bad compared to Blake. I mean, don't get me wrong, Miles had an awful night and he had to go through a lot, but I'm just gonna have to give the number 1 spot to Blake. Blake survives a helicopter crash and doesn't have a scratch on him, as well as falling off multiple cliffs. Blake is then further tormented by the memory of his childhood friend being and killed. So I'm going to have to add a point up there for some mental trauma, as that's kind of the side plot of the entire game, is that he's dealing with the trauma of his dead friend. Blake also gets physically and sexually assaulted throughout the night, as well as getting crucified with nails driven into the palm of his hands, and then later buried alive. His wife dies, and his brain basically goes dead as he's incoherent and lives the rest of his life in a Murkoff facility. I'm sure you could argue Miles had a worse night over Blake, but leave a comment letting me know. Bro, I feel like a teacher right now. Alright chat, leave 1 comment on this discussion post and reply to 2 other comments before the end of the week to receive full cursed content credit points. Anyways, thank you guys for watching the video, and hopefully see you guys in the next one. Peace.